Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is TURAN Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners, or shall I rather say viewers, because this is the first episode of TURAN Tales that you can not only listen to, but also watch. I don't know yet if this format will stay with us, but if you have an opinion about that, please let me know. My today's guest was born in 1991, so he's the same age as the independent states of Central Asia. A few years ago, he came up with an idea to check what's going on in the former Soviet republics and whether they have flourished during the last 36 years without the big brother Russia. His book, titled Farewell to Russia, A Journey Through the Former USSR, has just been published in the UK and the US. His name is Joe Luc Barnes, and you may recognize his voice from our audio documentaries where he volunteers with the voiceover. We will talk to him about his book, about traveling and living in the region of Central Asia, and about travel writing. Welcome to TURAN Talks. Hello, Joe. How are you? Thank you so much for accepting my invitation.
Hello, Agnieszka. I'm very well. And yes, really looking forward to it.
So let's maybe start from the very beginning. So when you first came with the idea to write a book, what were the main questions that you wanted answered?
Yeah, so I came to the book living through the 2010s. We went through this period of independence movements in my country, the United Kingdom. Scotland had this big independence referendum in 2014. Then we saw Greece's attempt to leave the euro. The United Kingdom had its referendum on the EU. Then I was in Spain in 2017 when Catalonia tried to make its bid for independence from Spain. And then there were the Hong Kong independence protests in 2019. So I'd been living in Russia and China during these periods. And it struck me, especially living in China, how anti-independence they were, and the even the most liberal Chinese person, the attitude that they would have to the idea of Hong Kong independence. They thought it was dangerous, extremism, splitting up the country. And this isn't necessarily people who were just following the Communist Party line. These were thinking people who had this real phobia of independence and autonomy for regions. We also saw this in Xinjiang as well. So a lot of this goes back, I think, through the conversations I've been having with Chinese people to the collapse of the USSR, which in China is taught as a very avoidable tragedy. Xi Jinping is on the record as saying no one was man enough to stand up and resist these movements of national uprising. Obviously, the Chinese version of standing up and resist led to Tiananmen Square, so I'm not sure we should be following his recipe. However, if you look at how China has performed economically and socially in the last 35 years since 1991 compared to the 15 countries of the former Soviet Union, the Chinese have a case for saying, well, maybe we did the right thing by staying together, by cracking down, to use a euphemism. So, when it became 2020, I had this idea of traveling through the former Soviet Union, and in time for the 30th anniversary of independence in 2021, I had the idea of writing this book, looking at the lessons we could learn from the independence of the 15 countries that formed part of the USSR. Obviously, this plan got delayed by the pandemic, so I had to begin it in 2022, and it was a rather epic, let's say, start to the book. as in February 22, which is just when I was writing the first chapter in Moscow, Russia invaded Ukraine. So this made it, I think, more pressing, a subject that we discussed, because a lot of the root causes of the Russian invasion go back to 1991 and the independence of Ukraine and the other Soviet republics. So that was the story behind the book. And essentially, yes, looking at the lessons we can learn from the independence of the former Soviet republics.
So what kind of answers you have found when it comes to Central Asia, when it comes to the 5 Central Asian republics?
Well, the first one is a salutary lesson, I guess. It's that things can always get worse. As bad as the USSR was, I probably wouldn't say it's as bad as, say, Turkmenistan is today, or Tajikistan. There were definitely some benefits and positives from being, especially in the later era, Soviet Union, and going to places like Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan. You see the mass unemployment that many of these countries had, which resulted in so many people working as migrants in Russia. Yeah, it does make you think, what was independence for? If, for example, you end up under a ruling dynasty like in Turkmenistan, or you become independent from Moscow only to have to go and work in Moscow to make ends meet. On the other hand, that we're wrong to say that independence hasn't had many benefits for people all around Central Asia, and especially if you go to the major metropoles, Almaty, Astana, Tashkent, you'll find that a whole generation of young people who, if you suggest to them that their country shouldn't be independent, they'd be very offended, and rightly so, given the opportunities that they've had. So it's certainly a mixed legacy and a mixed journey that these countries have been on.
Your book is mostly a travelogue, which is a genre not foreign to British writers. Do you feel part of this larger British tradition of travelers in Central Asia? And if so, what kind of writers inspired you maybe to write in this kind of style?
Great question. And yes, it's true. The first book that introduced Central Asia to me was the writing of Peter Hopkirk, who wrote this famous book called The Great Game, which I can see you laughing already. But
Great Game is my favorite topic, but let's maybe leave it for later.
Excellent. Well, his book is essentially a history written from mainly British archives. I think he used a few Russian sources. He used almost no Central Asian sources. But he writes it brilliantly. And he is a brilliant advertisement for the region, for many people who've come here. I know several British or American or English-speaking academics, journalists who have all been schooled in Peter Hopkirk's work as a great introduction to the region.
I think we all have. For better or worse.
Exactly, for better or worse, because I think, yes, he might have given a skewed and very pro-British opinion on the region, but he's got us into the region in the first place. So that would be my takeaway from travel writing in general. It's not, we are not professional historians. We do attempt to make sure we give as accurate portrayal as possible and get our facts right, but we want to make the region seem exciting, seem interesting. And this, as you say, I know the British tradition. I'm sure other countries have their own traditions. Obviously, Poland, you have Ryszard Kapuscinski, one of the great travel writers. But in Britain, the Great Game writers, the likes of Alexander Burns or Connolly, or in later period, likes of Fitzroy Maclean, they were essentially army officers who had been sent into this region to provide intelligence reports, but on the side did a bit of writing to make some money in the mass market. And especially Burns and Connolly, they were the first people to really put Central Asia on the map in Britain and inside the national consciousness. This was in the 1830s. So I guess like the USSR, there's a mixed legacy of travel writing.
But do you feel part of this tradition, or do you think you're proposing something else and something new, like a new way of looking at the region, and a new way also of British travel writing?
Well, I'd probably divide them into two camps. So the original Great Game travel writers, they weren't professional writers or journalists. They were military officers in general who spoke the local languages very well. So the likes of Burns and Connolly, they were fluent in Persian, which was generally the sort of courtly language in the 1830s. Hopkirk, I think, would be a different kettle of fish. And I've tried my best, or much more than he did, for example, to include local opinions. I'd say, in general, I've tried to be reasonably humble about what I know. The book that I've written, it's not just Central Asia; it's about 15 countries, and I don't think anyone would have the hubris or the arrogance to claim that they know everything about all 15 countries in the former Soviet Union. I do speak Russian as well as English, and that can get you so far. But yes, you have to trust the people you meet generally. And I think, in general, good travel writing, it shouldn't be about you as an individual. It should be about bringing the stories of the people you encounter on your journey to light and see what we can learn from those stories. That would be certainly my philosophy behind travel writing.
Well, this is what I wanted to ask you next. So, a lot of British travel writing, or in general, British writing about the world, had a specific colonial lens, obviously, and I think it still does, even though this is not the way we write about the world anymore. So usually it's a white male traveler coming from a prosperous world, a privileged social class who is visiting faraway countries and explaining how people live in other parts of the world in a very superficial way, from a position of cultural and economic superiority. And of course, this kind of writing is problematic, and of course, well, I mean, at least here in Central Asia, a lot of local writers or local journalists, local academics, try to look at the region from the perspective of a decolonial theory. So, did you have this kind of thinking in the back of your head when you were traveling? And if so, like, how exactly did you try to address this problem of this, white male travel writing, which obviously, I mean, let's face it, you're also a white male travel writer coming from a prosperous world.
Yes, I'm glad we're doing the video version of this podcast so everyone can see that I'm a white male. Yeah, I got as far as Georgia on the trip and went into a great little bookshop in Georgia called Prospero's. And inside, in a sort of pride of place in the bookshop, was a copy upon copy of Edward Said's Orientalism. So I bought myself a copy. This was the third country of the trip. Started reading a few pages, and I did think, this guy's got me. He's seen right through some of the definitely the instincts of writers from the Western world. So I'd answer it in two ways, because essentially your question is asking me kind of to justify my my raison d'être, my right to write such a book. I've had this asked to me a few times, generally actually by people in London or people who, as you suggested, are steeped in the decolonial theory. Not so often by sort of ordinary Central Asians who are rather pleased just generally that their country is getting some attention. I think one thing I noticed throughout the trip is, I know, even if it was small things such as having a UNESCO World Heritage Site, or if you saw the Winter Olympics recently, just winning an Olympic medal, or with tennis, Yelena Rybakina winning the Australian Open. Like, these events put, say, Kazakhstan on the map. And yeah, these are countries that are not that often discussed. So generally, I've found a very positive attitude to the fact I'm writing about these countries. However, there's definitely a defense that needs to be made for the right to write about countries. And I think, as I said before, it comes back to humility, comes back to not just being very shouty and having your own opinions and values. It's just generally listening to people, trying to find out what motivates people, what concerns they have, and try to bring them to light. I'm sure you'll know, having worked as a journalist in the region, it's not just the writer who has to have this attitude. It's often the editor who you really need to work with. And the number of times where I will pitch a piece that is talking about local opinions in, say, Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, and then I'll send it to the editor, and I'll get a reply that says, "Yeah, this is a really interesting story, but can you tell us what Putin might think about this?" And this is a very common thing to occur, and it can be very frustrating. But you do have to bear in mind that as a writer, you are writing for an audience. So you have to find that balance between giving people a taste of the new and the different societies that you're dealing with, but also relating it to things that they know. Because if you just throw someone into the midst of, I don't know, the history of the Hujum movement in Uzbekistan without any context, you might lose your readers quickly, or you might be writing for a very small audience, which would defeat my original purpose, which is to try to put these countries on the map.
But I actually, I know that these are the arguments that we usually hear from editors, but excuse me, I think they're bullshit. It's just that they are serving their own interests. They think that the audience would not be interested in reading about Hujum, which, in fact, I mean, it's so relatable because this is like Hujum, so like it translates into attack. It was a movement in the Soviet Union which, basically attacked the Islamic or the very conservative beliefs of local people and tried to unveil local women. I think this is completely translatable into, into situations or into contexts that Western audiences know very well. So I think that this is basically some sort of intellectual laziness on the part of our editors and people that we unfortunately have to deal with. And I think that with time, projects like Turan Tales will actually get more influence, because what we are trying to do, what I'm trying to do, is to tell the story of local people and of local countries from the local perspectives. And I think this is actually quite crucial, not to look at the world through the perspective of the big players. And I'm sure that, I mean, this is something that you and I share. So this is not like a, polemic with you. It's more to say that, this kind of attitude is extremely annoying. So I wanted to ask you, like, when we are already discussing this issue, is like, how are you trying to, I mean, how do you approach this? Because putting Central Asia on the map is important. Like telling local stories is important. So how to speak to people, how to talk to editors, how to talk to people in the UK for them to actually be interested in this part of the world, as it is, not as a backyard of Russia or China?
Great question. And I would definitely say amen to what you were saying about the importance of platforms like Turan Tales for delivering local stories in the absence of editorial interest. How do we get Central Asia on the map? Well, interesting you should ask me this. I think it was a week ago. The Uzbek, must be the communications ministry or foreign ministry or something like that, hosted the Tony Blair Institute to ask them this exact question: how can we get more attention on our countries? I think it has to be it was a long-term process, and I think it has to be tied to other things. So you'll find that a lot of writing on Central Asia is done through travel. So places like Uzbekistan have been reasonably successful over the last 10 years or so in opening up and encouraging tourism to the country. And with tourism comes interest. With interest comes an audience that wants to spread the good word. Same with economic links. The more economic links there are between countries, the likelihood of people-to-people engagement and therefore interest in their affairs and especially business journalism, that creates a market there. So you need to have a foundation to build on. And if I were advising the Uzbek government, I would be saying, but partly as they're doing, like they've made it visa free to get to Uzbekistan. You've got from Britain anyway, flights from Manchester and London direct to Tashkent. I think that would be a start. As journalists, I tend to find the subjects that interest editors. Yeah, sadly, they do tend to be Russia-related, China-related. Climate journalism is becoming a bigger thing. I mean, you don't really want this. I mean, you'd rather be reporting positive things or interesting cultural things about countries. But
why?
I don't know. It's
why would you like to write positive things? I mean,
well, no, I'm not necessarily
who writes positive things.
I'm not necessarily saying positive things about the regimes, but you would generally want. I mean, this is what I've found in living in Kazakhstan or moving around the region. Everyone would like their country to be seen positively, or at least known positively. This is what point I was making about.
Yeah, but I mean, we're not really writing for the regimes, right? We're writing for audiences and we're trying to present those countries we live in, not necessarily as, positive and good regimes. And I mean, that's not the point, right? We should be presenting what is happening here and maybe, some issues from local perspectives, but that doesn't necessarily mean things that are positive for the, ruling regimes.
Yeah, of course. You always have to be drawing a line between the regime and the country. I'm not suggesting we all become regime apologists for Turkmenistan or anything like that. But yeah, like I said, if it's something like climate, it is. I'm just saying it is sad that we are having to report on seas drying up, oil spills, river levels not being high enough, water scarcity. I mean, water's a massive issue, not just in Central Asia, but around the world. And I'm just saying it's a shame that these are the things that tend to get picked up and written about.
Hey, quick little break. Thanks for listening to Turan Tales. We're a tiny independent show supported by listeners like you. If you like our work, you can get a paid subscription at turantales.substack.com/subscribe or buymeacoffee.com/turantales. Okay, back to the episode. maybe this is just like a digression because I would like to move forward, but I actually have a feeling that a lot of the reporting that is being done from Central Asia is too positive. It's all about travel. It's all about, Uzbekistan and the beautiful Silk Road, which I think is actually not a good thing, because there's a lot of bad things happening, and a lot of human rights abuses, which I think should be getting much more coverage than they do. But let's leave it. And before coming to before coming to Kazakhstan, where we both live now, you lived in Russia and you lived in China. So I wonder what sort of expectations you had when you lived in the two big players in the region, and before coming to Kazakhstan. Like, what sort of vision you had of Central Asia, having spent time only in the big neighbors?
Well, I first came to Kazakhstan in 2016. My view of the country had been informed by those two infamous forces, Borat and Peter Hopkirk. So didn't have too much to go on. I really got to know the country in 2022. But what would be my vision of it from China? And I think this is a general Chinese vision of its neighbors. The general Chinese person doesn't know a huge amount of geography, and is unaware of what's going on in most of its neighbors. You could sort of understand this, given that it's 1.4 billion people in China and only 20 million in Kazakhstan. So what's that? Like, I'll butcher the maths, I'm sure, but not 0.5%, I think, of the population. It's hard to, despite Kazakhstan's size, physical size, it's hard for Chinese people to necessarily give it too much time of day. Although it's worth noting that on the Communist Party level, Kazakhstan is seen as quite a valuable partner. Obviously, it was the country where Xi Jinping started the Belt and Road Initiative. In Russia, it was never mentioned too much. There was obviously a lot of ethnic Russians who had been born in Kazakhstan, who I would meet in Moscow when I lived there. But it was never a major item on the news. My period living in Russia, it was a very Western-focused news outlet. There were events going on in Ukraine, things happening in America or Europe. I find that Russia generally doesn't tend to cover Central Asia too heavily on its news network. So it was a bit of a blank slate before I came here.
So was there anything that particularly surprised you or struck you in Central Asia? I mean, let's maybe start from Kazakhstan.
What really surprised me when I first arrived, I'd say generally, having lived here now for at least a year or so, and having first properly travelled to Kazakhstan in 2022, the infrastructure, the general wealth and prosperity, especially in the larger cities. Well, actually, just in two cities. I would say outside that, it's generally doesn't seem to be that prosperous. And the level of English amongst young people, and especially having been there since 2022, the real shift towards Kazakh language and pride in being Kazakh. I think I moved. Yeah, when I was in 2022. It must have been 5 months after the war in Ukraine had started, and there was a real sense. This is something that I felt in the other 15 countries. A real sense of shock about the war, and a real feeling that we could be next. If Ukraine falls, maybe they're coming for North Kazakhstan. Maybe they're coming for Georgia. I would get this attitude quite a lot, and leading from that, I felt that there had been a lot of music in Kazakh that had been promoted. People were trying to read in Kazakh language, something they hadn't done before. So in some ways, the war in Ukraine has really instigated a sort of second wave of I wouldn't call it nationalism. I'd call it more a patriotic revival in one's own culture.
And how about other countries? Was there anything that particularly surprised you or struck you in Uzbekistan, for example?
Well, the first thing that surprised me in Uzbekistan, the biggest change that I've seen in the really 3 years that I've really been traveling and to the country, has been on a superficial level, the really visible Chinese influence. And this is most prevalent in the cars. I'm sure you'll remember from your time there that the first thing that used to strike anyone traveling to Uzbekistan was the fact that every single car was a white Chevrolet. And in just 3 years or so, about half the cars in Tashkent they're still white, but they're produced by BYD or you'd have to push me on Chinese car manufacturers, but Hongqi, for example. So that would be the big superficial change in Uzbekistan. In Kyrgyzstan is a country that's changed almost beyond recognition in just the 3 years that I've been covering it. There was still the last vestiges of the island of democracy that Kyrgyzstan used to be called. In 2022, you had a very sort of active civil society, and then it's definitely taken an authoritarian turn. But I'd say possibly just as large a change has been the economic boom that Kyrgyzstan has seen. So in the book, I write about Kyrgyzstan as one of the biggest losers from the collapse of the Soviet Union. It used to be a massive recipient of subsidies from Moscow, which produced which gave a huge amount of money to its national budget. It used to be a big part of the USSR's military-industrial complex. So you had, a big torpedo site on Issyk-Kul. You had the Lenin arms factory in the center of Bishkek. All of these things slowly but surely were taken away, and you were left with a country without much at all economically, apart from one big gold mine in Kumtor, and then 25-30% of the GDP being made up by remittances from people working in Russia. So my chapter on Kyrgyzstan was writing about that, and over the last 3 years, I had to completely revise my opinion on the country because it's undergone a huge boom, partly through facilitating Russian sanctions evasion. Kyrgyzstan is now one of the largest exporters of Chinese cars in the world, despite not having any car factories, or maybe having, I think it's got one now. This has not only helped sort of the exporting part of the economy, but that extra money that's been coming in has really seen this big housing boom. The government's become a lot more effective in collecting taxes, which I would presume is partly linked to the sort of digitalization of the economy. I think you used to have a large grey economy, and it's much harder to hide digital payments than it is to hide cash payments. So the tax take has gone up, and this has given the government extra money to throw around and to support economic growth. And then as across the whole region, as I alluded to in Uzbekistan, you've seen this huge wave of Chinese investment and infrastructure projects, which had begun in Kazakhstan. But in Tajikistan, for example, there was a wonderful new road from Dushanbe to Khujand, the second city in the country that is not only Chinese built, but it's really helped connectivity in the country. So these are some of the things that even in the last 3 years that I've the changes I've witnessed.
Okay, so how about Turkmenistan? What struck you there, or what surprised you?
Well, I mean, it's you go into Turkmenistan only hearing sort of these sort of hushed, whispered rumors about how mad the country is supposedly, and I hadn't met anyone who had actually been to the country before. I had one ethnic Russian Turkmen friend who gave me an idea of what to expect. So first impression, well, just as every car in Uzbekistan is white, Turkmenistan sort of in Ashgabat takes that to the next level, where it's not just the cars, it's every building. And I think even non-white cars are banned from the city centre in Ashgabat. I subsequently found out that the leader of the country, or now the sort of father of the leader of the country, he was a dentist. So I'm presuming this explains the penchant for everything white, gleaming white. It was also I think it's the city with the largest number of fountains in the world, which I'd be interested to see how they will sustain that given the water crisis that's might unfold once the Koktepe Canal gets built in Afghanistan. Other impressions were just the amazing contrast between the splendor of Ashgabat and the rest of the country, where you would just see these roads, and it was like going across like a lunar landscape. There was no drive on the left or the right. Cars were just trying to find the best way to traverse these shocking roads and still retain their suspension. And yeah, you would see amazing poverty in the rural areas. Turkmenistan, like Uzbekistan, claims to have stopped child labor for cotton farming. That was not what I saw. For example, you would see sort of 7, 8-year-olds in the fields, sort of faces burnt black from the sun, and just looking forlorn as they're sort of forced to do the cotton harvest. So yeah, I felt it's. I mean, it's easy to really exoticize and to make Turkmenistan seem to be this sort of cool, mad place that you go to. But when you get to the rural areas, you just think this is built on the back of slave labor and a people who've just been oppressed. Just very, very sad. That was my overwhelming feeling having been there.
So you did your trip in 2022 and 3, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you moved to Kazakhstan and you were finishing writing your book in Kazakhstan. I wonder, is there anything that you would have written differently? Looking at your book from today's perspective, because time has passed. You lived in Central Asia. You've lived in Central Asia for like over a year now. Is there anything that changed in your perception of the region and writing?
I don't think I would have written anything differently, because I think a travel book should be about your travels. There's places I would have liked to include. I was really disappointed to have to cut a section on the Aral Sea, because I think water and climate is going to be such a huge issue in Central Asia over the next century. Same with China. I think I probably underemphasized the role of China, potentially because it wasn't so visibly evident. Obviously, you have a lot of Chinese investment, but things like the phones, the cars, the CCTV cameras, they weren't as evident in 2022 as they are in 2025. Islam, I do mention. There's obviously a lot more I could dig into with the relationship of the whole region with Islam. I suppose one of the factors which limited that is potentially my language ability, because I would say there's this is a very sweeping statement, but I'd say the majority of Russian speakers in the big cities are not necessarily hardcore Islamists, whereas you do get, I think, a stronger faith amongst more rural population and amongst people who don't necessarily speak Russian. So I'd say those people are probably underrepresented in the book. Although I do my best to include them, I'd say, I think that would have been a big challenge, having to learn a new language and really spend some time. But that's one thing I would have loved to have done more of. So water, China, Islam.
But regardless, you have written a really fascinating book, a great travelogue about Central Asia, but not only, about all the 15 post-Soviet republics. And I think you do it in a very respectful way, which is admirable. And I really recommend you all to read Joe's book titled Farewell to Russia. What's the second part of it?
Farewell to Russia, a journey through the former USSR.
There you go. Thank you so much. It was a great pleasure to have you here, and see you soon.
Yes, thank you very much. Huge fan of the show, so it's an honor to have finally made it on.
Thank you. That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.